The destroyer JS Chokai just fired a Tomahawk cruise missile from its own vertical launch tubes out over open water for the first time in Japan's history. According to USNI News, the launch happened during a joint live-fire exercise with the United States Navy, and it's the first operational use of a long-range strike weapon Tokyo only started acquiring a few years ago, as Chinese naval power keeps growing across the water from it. 3 things matter here: what the live-fire drill actually confirmed and what it didn't. Why Japan fast-tracked a missile system that wasn't originally scheduled to arrive for years, and what a strike range of roughly 1,600 kilometers puts within reach of a Japanese warship for the first time since the end of World War II. First, what's confirmed? USNI News reports that Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force carried out the first live-fire launch of a Tomahawk cruise missile from one of its own warships, the destroyer JS Chokai, during a joint exercise with the U.S. Navy. That's the headline. A Japanese crew on a Japanese-flagged ship fired a Tomahawk under its own command authority. Not a demonstration on American soil. Not a simulation. A live shot from a Japanese vertical launch system at sea with American forces there as exercise partners, not as the ones pulling the trigger. The reporting frames this as a milestone in Japan's rollout of the Tomahawk, a weapon Tokyo began acquiring from Washington to build what Japanese officials call a long-range strike capability aimed at deterring China's expanding fleet. The missile's range, widely cited at around 1,600 kilometers, matters here almost as much as the launch itself. We'll get to what that number actually means in a few minutes. I spent a while digging into how Japan got here, because on paper, none of this should have moved this fast. One detail kept nagging me. This program was supposed to take years longer than it did. To understand why a live Tomahawk launch from a Japanese destroyer matters, you need some background on the missile itself. The Tomahawk is a subsonic, long-range, all-weather cruise missile built by the United States in service with the U.S. Navy since the 1980s and used in nearly every major American military operation since the first Gulf War. It flies low, follows terrain or a pre-programmed route, and can launch from a ship's vertical launch system or a submarine torpedo tube. Depending on the variant, its range runs from roughly 1,000 to 1,600 kilometers, which is the figure tied to this story. That's not a short-range defensive weapon. It's built to strike targets deep inland, well beyond the range of the anti-ship missiles Japan has historically fielded. For 70 years, Japan didn't operate anything like it. Article 9 of Japan's post-war constitution renounces the right to wage war and, in the interpretation that held for decades, limited the self-defense forces to a strictly defensive posture. Japan built one of the most capable, best-funded militaries in Asia, but around intercepting incoming threats, not striking targets on someone else's territory. A long-range, land-attack-capable cruise missile sat well outside that posture. That's the obstacle Japan actually had to clear, and at first it wasn't a technical one. It was political and constitutional. In December 2022, Japan's government formally revised its core security documents and adopted what it calls a counter-strike capability, or Hengeki Norioku, allowing the self-defense forces to hold and use weapons capable of striking an adversary's territory under specific conditions, mainly as a response to an attack already underway or clearly imminent. That policy shift, not any sudden change in the missile's engineering, is what opened the door to Japan buying Tomahawks in the first place. Tokyo and Washington then agreed on a deal, reported at the time by Reuters and other outlets, for Japan to acquire around 400 Tomahawk missiles, split between older and newer variants, at a cost in the billions of dollars. Even after the political obstacle cleared, there was a second one. The missiles were originally scheduled to arrive on a slower timeline, with full operational integration expected later in the decade. Tokyo pushed to move that up, citing the pace of Chinese naval expansion in the region. The JS Chokai launch is the visible result of that acceleration, a live-fire event years earlier in the program's life than the original plan called for. You'd think a program this politically sensitive would move slowly by default, with every step litigated in Parliament for years before a single missile changed hands. It didn't. Japan's Diet debated the counter-strike doctrine, budget hawks and pacifist-leaning lawmakers pushed back in the usual ways, and the policy passed anyway, faster than similar shifts have historically moved through Japanese politics. That's why this story is worth separating from the broader, slower trend of Japan gradually expanding its military posture since the 2010s. This wasn't gradual. It was a compressed sequence of decisions that most observers expected to take the rest of the decade. It also helps to understand what Japan was building toward before Tomahawk entered the picture, because the missile didn't arrive into a vacuum. Japan's Navy, formerly the Maritime Self-Defense Force, already operates one of the most capable fleets in Asia by tonnage and technology, built almost entirely around Aegis-equipped destroyers, submarines, and helicopter carriers, funded by one of the largest defense budgets in the region. What it lacked, by design and by law, was the ability to strike a target on land, at range, from any of those platforms. Tomahawk doesn't make that fleet bigger. It changes what the fleet Japan already built is now allowed and able to do. The mission wasn't over once the policy allowed it and the missiles started arriving. It still had to actually work on the ship. That's Arc 1, more or less resolved. Arc 2 is where the real engineering problem was hiding, inside the destroyer itself. JS Chokai is one of 4 Kongu-class destroyers in the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, a class that entered service in the late 1990s and was built around Lockheed Martin's Aegis combat system, closely related in design to the U.S. Navy's Arleigh Burke-class destroyers. These ships were designed from the outset with the Mark 41 vertical launch system, the same family of launch cells used across the U.S. Navy and NATO fleets, which is why Tomahawk integration onto an existing Japanese hull was possible on a fast timeline instead of requiring a new ship class altogether. The missiles themselves are a known quantity. The launch cells were already sitting in the deck. What had to be built, tested, and certified was the software, fire control integration, and crew qualification needed to let a Japanese Aegis destroyer command and fire a weapon it had never been cleared to use. That's the quieter, less cinematic obstacle behind this story. Certifying an existing warship and an existing crew to safely and reliably fire a new class of weapon in a live exercise, working with the U.S. Navy to confirm the systems talk to each other correctly. A live fire test is really the final exam at the end of that process, not the beginning of it. If the missile hadn't left the tube cleanly, or the targeting data hadn't lined up, that would have been the story instead. What strikes us most about this case is how much of the real work happened before anyone fired anything. The headline is a missile leaving a launch tube. The substance is a legal reinterpretation, a procurement acceleration, and a certification process, all of which had to land in the right order for that 30 seconds of live fire to happen at all. That's usually true of military milestones. The visible moment is the smallest part of the story. Something about the pacing of this program stands out, even now. Japan spent decades treating a defensive-only posture as close to a constitutional bright line, then went from formally adopting a counterstrike doctrine to an actual live Tomahawk launch from an existing warship in under 4 years. Whatever you think of the policy itself, that's not a slow bureaucratic drift. That's a deliberate sprint. Now, for the part of this that's genuinely contested, where it's worth separating fact from interpretation. The launch itself is a confirmed event, reported by USNI News and tied to a named ship and a named exercise partner. What is not a fact, but an assessment, is what this means for the region going forward, and reasonable people read it differently. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. Fast-tracking a long-range strike weapon onto an existing Japanese warship, instead of waiting for the originally planned timeline, reads less like caution and more like Tokyo deciding it can no longer afford to wait out its own procurement schedule. Some analysts call that prudent deterrence against a Chinese fleet that keeps adding hulls faster than almost any navy in modern history. Others call the same move one more step in a regional arms dynamic where every side's acceleration becomes the next side's justification for accelerating too. Both readings are defensible. Neither is a settled fact, and this video isn't going to pretend one side has already won that argument. So here's a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. Does putting a roughly 1,600-kilometer strike weapon on an existing Japanese destroyer make the region more stable because it raises the cost of aggression against Japan, or less stable because it gives every neighboring capital one more reason to expand its own arsenal? We're not going to tell you the answer. We'd actually like to know what you think. To be clear about what that range means in practical terms, a missile with roughly a 1,600-kilometer reach, launched from a ship in Japanese waters, can in principle reach targets well beyond Japan's immediate coastline, depending on where the launching ship is positioned. That's the capability shift analysts point to when they talk about regional deterrence. Not that Japan now has some novel superweapon. The Tomahawk itself is decades old and used by multiple allied navies. but that a country which spent 70 years without any land attack strike option at sea now has one, mounted on a warship it already owns and operates today. Back to what's actually confirmed versus what remains outside the public record. That distinction matters more here than in almost any other kind of story. Confirmed, a live-fire Tomahawk launch from JS Chokai, reported by USNI News, tied to a joint exercise with the U.S. Navy and described as Japan's first such launch from one of its own ships. Confirmed from prior reporting, Japan's 2022 adoption of a counterstrike doctrine and a subsequent agreement to acquire Tomahawk missiles from the United States, numbering in the hundreds across older and newer missile variants. Confirmed as general background, the Tomahawk's approximate range class, the Kongu-class destroyers Aegis and Mark 41 vertical launch architecture, and the broader U.S.-Japan alliance framework under which this kind of joint exercise takes place. Not confirmed, at least not in what's publicly reported so far. The exact date of the live-fire event, the exact location where it happened, whether the round fired carried a live warhead or was a telemetry-only test, and how many missiles in total were used during the exercise. Analysts have offered broader assessments of what this means for regional deterrence, but those are assessments, not facts about the drill itself, and we're not going to blur that line for you. There's a line in most defense reporting on programs like this that almost reads like a formality, easy to skim past. Officials describing a capability as intended to counter a rival power rather than to threaten one. It's worth sitting with that phrasing for a second, because the distinction it's drawing between deterrence and offense is exactly the distinction Japan's entire post-war defense identity was built around, and exactly the distinction this program is testing in practice, not just in policy documents. Put yourself in the position of a defense planner in Tokyo for a second. You've spent your whole career inside a strictly defensive doctrine. Now you're being asked to certify a crew, a ship, and a command structure to use a weapon class your country avoided by design for 70 years on a compressed timeline, while the security environment around you keeps shifting faster than your original planning assumed. That's not a hypothetical for the people running this program. That's the actual job, right now, this year. So what's still genuinely unknown, meaning not yet public rather than deliberately hidden? How quickly Japan intends to certify additional Kongu-class or newer destroyers to carry and fire Tomahawks beyond JS Chokai, whether this exercise was a one-off demonstration shot or the start of a regular live-fire qualification cycle. And what, if anything, neighboring governments say once their own defense ministries issue formal statements, which, as of this reporting, hadn't happened yet in any detailed way. If you want to track this yourself rather than take our word for it, USNI News and Naval News both cover Japanese and U.S. Navy exercises closely, and Japan's Ministry of Defense publishes its own English-language statements on major capability milestones. We cut a couple of details from this one for length, mainly around how Tomahawk fire control data gets shared between U.S. and Japanese Aegis systems during a joint drill like this. If that's the kind of thing you want a deeper breakdown of, tell us in the comments and we'll put together a follow-up on how U.S.-Japan naval interoperability actually works under the hood. So where does that leave things? A Japanese warship fired a Tomahawk cruise missile on its own authority for the first time in the country's history during a joint drill with the U.S. Navy, 4 years after Tokyo formally opened the door to owning that kind of weapon at all. The missile is old technology. The ship is an existing, decades-old hull. What's new is the decision and the speed at which Japan chose to act on it. Whether that decision makes the region safer or more combustible isn't something this video is going to settle for you, and honestly, it isn't something anyone can settle yet. What is settled is that the debate itself has changed, because Japan now has a capability it spent generations without, sitting in a launch tube that used to hold something else entirely. We'll be tracking what Tokyo does with it next.